He told everyone she was just a friend, but his eyes never left her. Julian Cross, tech billionaire, was raising a glass with his fiancée when Zaria Blake entered the room. She didn't speak, didn't smile, just stood there, wine glass in hand, eyes avoiding his. But he didn't avoid her. For one fleeting second, Julian looked at her as if the world had vanished. Then he turned, just in time to smile, just in time to say, "Zaria, just a close family friend." A guest behind them leaned over and whispered, "Is she with the event team?" Celeste, the bride-to-be, tightened her grip on his hand, and Zaria, surrounded by faces that wouldn't speak her name, realized the truth was never welcome in that room. Julian Cross wasn't raised to choose. He was born the sole heir to the Cross family, synonymous with banking, politics, and media power. Since childhood he was called the successor, not because he wanted it, but because no one gave him time to want anything else. Every step was pre-decided. Which schools, which vacations, even who was allowed to sit at their table. Julian was gifted in tech. He built his first game at 13, but his father only said, "A Cross doesn't code, he hires coders." Talent was his, but fame? Never really about him. He grew up in the spotlight, but never once saw the light. Zaria Blake never had a clean start. Her mother was addicted by the time Zaria was in elementary school. They lived in a makeshift home behind an abandoned church. Some nights, rats ran across her feet and shouting echoed through thin walls. Zaria never complained. She taught herself to read under streetlights, borrowed an old library laptop, and learned to code. At 17, she left. No degree, no references, no one knew her name. She once slept on the floor of a 24-hour co-working space, using her coat as a pillow. She had no funding, but she had a kind of persistence no one could teach. Zaria once said, "I didn't belong in their world, so I built one where I did." 3 a.m. Crosstech's entire security system collapsed under a massive data breach. Julian stood frozen in the command room, screens flashing red, investors already calling. An assistant asked, "Should we call third-party support?" The CTO shook his head. "I know someone, but she's not on your usual list." 30 minutes later, Zaria walked in. Hair tied up, gray hoodie, no greetings, no pleasantries. She scanned the system, then sat, typed one line, then another. Julian stared, stunned. He'd never seen a woman code like that. No one smiled, no one spoke, but the room began to breathe again. Zaria didn't talk much. She came in, opened her laptop, placed one earbud in. The other ear always left free, listening for signals. For 72 hours, she barely left her desk. Black coffee, crumbs of protein bars on notebook paper, scribbled notes in pencil on her sweatshirt sleeve. Julian watched her from the corner. She never asked. She just did, and every line of code felt like instinct. He didn't fully understand her syntax, but for the first time in years, he trusted someone without needing a reason. When the system finally recovered and the screens turned green, no one clapped. But Julian looked at Zaria and knew he'd remember that light longer than any round of applause. Zaria mumbled while coding, as if the system could hear her. Short sentences, a sigh, here, a breath there. Julian sat across, holding a cold coffee cup, and for the first time in months, he smiled. Not for anything grand, but because she made him forget the world was falling apart. Close to midnight on day 2, Julian placed down 2 cups of instant noodles. He said nothing. She didn't thank him. They ate on the floor, shoulders apart, eyes down. But for once they weren't thinking about data, shareholders, or subpoenas. Zaria murmured, "I prefer hardware to people. At least it responds when you do something right." Julian didn't reply, but he heard her, and he understood. The project wrapped by early morning on day 4. Zaria packed up in silence. Screens stable, data secured. Julian leaned on the doorframe, hands in his pockets, paused, then quietly asked, "If I asked you to dinner, and not for work, would that be okay?" Zaria paused, looked up, no question. No flinch, just a small nod. Enough for him to see. Julian smiled softly, like even he didn't expect those words to come out of his mouth. They didn't pick fancy places, just a small diner in a neighborhood no one from Julian's world stepped into. Yellow lights, worn wooden tables, broth in the air. Zaria arrived first, always did. Julian came later, cap low, scanning the room before he sat. They talked about things no one asked. retro games, weird bug patches, odd childhoods. Once, Zaria reached across the table to touch his hand. Julian pulled away, gently, but clearly. She didn't get upset. She was used to it. Outside, they were CEO and consultant. In here, they were just two people holding on to something that had no name. Every time they left, Julian let her walk ahead, as if this feeling only existed when no one was watching. One late night, after a long meeting, they sat in his car, streetlight casting shadows through the window. Rain just stopped. Zaria leaned her head back, voice steady. "I know you won't choose me." Julian turned, didn't deny it, didn't promise. Just silence. Zaria sighed. Not from pain, but from having heard that answer before. She stayed, not out of weakness, but because she believed. Sometimes people need more time to be brave. Julian looked at her for a long while, said nothing. Some connections are full of love, but not enough courage. Have you ever been there? It was a cross-family charity gala. Zaria was invited as a strategic advisor, but no one introduced her. No one asked her name. She wore a simple black dress, stepped toward the reception. Just then, Julian's mother turned around. She glanced at Zaria, reached into her purse, held out a bill. "Can you bring me a glass of white wine? No ice, please." Zaria stood still, didn't take it, didn't reply. Julian stood 3 steps away, saw everything, but said nothing, not a word. Zaria didn't look away. She met his eyes, held the gaze, longer than usual, much longer, then turned, walked past his mother, not saying a single word. They sat in the car after a private event in Midtown. Windows up, no press, no familiar faces. Zaria stared out at the street. Headlights painted one side of her face in light, the other in shadow. She didn't dance around it. "What am I in your life?" Julian was silent for a few seconds, then spoke, softer than usual. "You know, you're special." Zaria didn't look at him. "Special isn't a place. I don't want to be something you have to hide." Outside, people passed by. Inside, the silence lasted longer than the drive they'd just taken. Julian placed his hands on the steering wheel, but didn't start the engine, and Zaria understood, once again, that feelings aren't defined by what we say, but by what we choose not to do. The next morning, the headline on Forbes broke the story. Julian Cross was officially engaged to Celeste Langford, daughter of one of New York's oldest financial dynasties. The photo was taken in Tuscany. Sunset, a sapphire ring, the bride smiling. Julian held her hand like it was always meant to be. Zaria stared at the screen. No gasps, no tears. She just straightened her posture, scrolled slowly, read every word, every congratulations, every comment. Then she closed the laptop. Not rushed, not slow. The room was quiet. No notifications, no calls. But inside her, something just shut off. Not loud, but final. 3 days after the engagement, the media began digging into an unconfirmed past relationship between Julian and Zaria. One headline blared, "Tech Mistress? Where is the woman who saved Julian Cross during his crisis?" Below were hundreds of comments. "She just aimed too high. Smart move. Fix the company, then try to claim the CEO." Zaria read every line. No replies, no reposts, no clarifications. Julian remained completely silent. No defense, no PR statement. She wasn't surprised, but this silence, this time, felt different. Because now she was alone, facing the world. And he was standing on the side of it. Zaria submitted a funding proposal for an independent tech project. Clear concept. 3-year development plan. Core technology already proven, inside Julian's own system. She wore a crisp white blouse, came fully prepared, sat across from a senior director at a major investment bank. He skimmed the file for less than 3 minutes, flipped to the last page, then closed it. "I'm afraid it lacks sufficient market credibility." Zaria asked for specifics. He smiled, polite. "If you were partnered with someone more recognized in the field, say Julian Cross, then it'd be a different story." Zaria said nothing. She gathered the papers, slid them into her leather folder, and walked out. It didn't rain that day, but the air outside felt just as cold as his words. Julian sent her an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. Clear terms, No sharing of personal affiliations. No mention of any detail from their time working together. At the bottom was a handwritten note. Just wait until after the IPO. I promise I'll make everything public. Zaria read every clause. Her hands didn't shake, but her eyes grew red. She didn't ask questions, didn't protest. She signed with one firm stroke. Julian sat across from her, not daring to meet her gaze. The paper folded neatly, slipped into a plain white envelope. Thin, light, but it carried the weight of betrayal. Sometimes there's no need to lie. Silencing someone is enough to turn truth into fiction. Zaria received a copy of the patent file from the legal department. Thick printout. Familiar project code. The very system she had built from the first line of code. She flipped to the co-founder section. First name, Julian Cross. Second name, Z. Black. Not Zaria Blake. Not a typo, not a printing error. She knew exactly what it was. A quiet erasure. Subtle but legal. Enough to deny her rightful ownership. Zaria sat alone in her old office, sunlight slanting across the page. She didn't tear the file, didn't flinch, just circled the wrong name. Precisely. Then folded it, tucked it away. Some betrayals don't need words. Just one misspelled name can erase everything that was ever real. Zaria showed up at Julian's office near midnight. No text, no warning. He was alone, as usual. Desk lamp on, papers spread out. She stood for a few seconds, then said, "I'm not here to beg for anything." Julian looked up, eyes tired. Zaria continued, voice steady, "I just need you to choose, clearly, for once in your life." Silence. Only the hum of the AC and the sterile white light against the glass walls. Julian lowered his head, fingers spinning a pen on the table. No reply. No eye contact. Zaria nodded faintly. No tears. No blame. She turned. The door closed gently behind her. No slam. But everything had ended long before that. Not everyone walks away in tears. Some leave, simply to reclaim themselves. Zaria wasn't told about the wedding. She found out through an old colleague, someone who accidentally forwarded the invite to an email address that once belonged to her. The ceremony would take place on a private beach in Maine, an exclusive resort, hand-picked guest list, double security. Zaria wasn't shocked, wasn't angry. She just sat quietly, staring at the digital invite. Classic font. Julian and Celeste's names, side by side. The day before the wedding, she sent Julian one last message. Short, no well wishes. Losing me means losing the part of yourself that was still real. No response. She didn't need one. She didn't write to be answered. She wrote to end it, and walk forward, this time for herself. Naomi, Celeste's younger sister, never truly bought into Julian. To her, he was polished, professional, and a little too careful to fully trust. But one day, Naomi stumbled across an old video from a tech conference. Zaria on stage, presenting. Julian in the front row, eyes locked, unblinking. Naomi rewound. Froze the frame. That look, it wasn't business. It was the look of a man who had once loved deeply. She started connecting the dots, the sudden disappearances, the late calls, the way Julian deflected whenever Celeste asked questions. Naomi didn't know the full story, but she believed one thing. This wedding was hiding something. What do you think? If you were Naomi, would you speak up? Comment your thoughts below. Naomi didn't ask Celeste. She didn't want to hurt her sister, not without proof. Instead, she hired a private investigator, someone who specialized in quiet problems for the ultra-rich. Within a week, the findings came in on a small USB. Naomi opened it on her laptop. First clip, Julian and Zaria leaving a Brooklyn diner close to midnight. He opened the car door for her. His hand lightly touched her back. Second image, taken through glass. Zaria asleep on Julian's shoulder in the office. Then, a voice message. His voice. "You're the only thing that ever made me feel real." Naomi leaned back in her chair. Exhaled. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was something closer to sorrow. The truth was surfacing. And she knew this secret wouldn't stay buried much longer. Over 300 invitations were sent. The wedding of Julian Cross and Celeste Langford, touted as the perfect union of tech and old money. Location, a snow-dusted estate tucked deep in the Vermont mountains. Press coverage was tightly curated. The guest list, Global investors, hedge fund CEOs, heirs of legacy empires, every detail underwent triple approval, from table linen colors to imported Dutch florals. Julian was quieter than usual. No social posts, no interviews, just 7 days left. Time ticking down. Everything appeared flawless. But the one thing that couldn't be curated was what would happen when the truth arrived, right as the whole world was watching. The sacred moment. A glass hall blanketed in white flowers. Light spilled from the ceiling like a forest chapel. Julian stood beside Celeste, both dressed with effortless elegance. The officiant spoke. "If anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace." Silence. Then, a chair scraped gently. Naomi stood. No trembling, no hesitation. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was razor clear. "I object." All eyes turned. Cameras clicked like lightning. Julian's head snapped. Celeste froze. Naomi reached into her purse, pulled out a white envelope, laid it on the glass table. Not out of envy, but because truth deserves to be heard. No one moved. Time itself seemed to hold its breath, and in that instant, the earthquake began. Naomi didn't cry. She opened the white envelope. First, a photo of Julian and Zaria in the office after midnight, his hand gently resting on her shoulder, not candid. A captured truth. Next, printed text messages. Julian's voice. "I only feel real when I'm with you." Then, a patent document. Co-founder names. Z. Black, circled in red ink. Zaria's handwritten note in the margin. Not a typo, a betrayal. The room grew heavy as stone. No cough, no whisper, just stillness. Celeste turned to Julian. Her eyes held no pride, only the unspoken question. "Who have you ever truly loved?" Julian gave no answer, but truth stood there, undeniable, exposed, with nowhere left to hide. Celeste said nothing. She removed her veil, set it gently on the chair, lifted her gown, and walked straight down the aisle, past 300 silent guests. No one stopped her. Cameras kept rolling. The live stream didn't pause. Over 1 million viewers witnessed it live. The bride walking out of her own wedding. Julian didn't move, his face expressionless, but his hands hung limp as if something had slipped from his grasp, and he no longer knew where to find it. The officiant halted mid-sentence. Music cut out, a slow pan from the camera. Julian, alone, surrounded by white flowers on what was supposed to be the pinnacle of his legacy, now just an empty stage. No one came forward. No one touched his shoulder. That moment needed no tears. Because the greatest failure is not knowing who you are, even to yourself. 2 weeks after the wedding collapsed, a headline shook the tech world. Zaria Blake had officially filed a lawsuit against Julian Cross and Crosstech, alleging patent theft. The filing was 87 pages long. It included original code, revision history, timestamp logs, internal emails, and proof that Julian had knowingly altered her name on intellectual property filings. No threats, no warning, just a clean, airtight submission through the proper legal channel. The media called it the quiet counterstrike, but it hit like thunder through Silicon Valley. Zaria made no appearances, no press, no interviews. She chose just one way to answer every wound, with truth and with law. Within 3 days of the lawsuit's release, Montenegro Tech's stock began to plummet. Monday, down 12%. Tuesday, another 19%. By week's end, the executive board called an emergency session. Too late. Major investors pulled out. Global funds froze deals. Strategic partners revoked algorithm licenses. The headlines screamed, "Julian Cross's empire is cracking." Not just a love story. This is a war over intellectual property. Within 2 weeks, nearly half the engineering team resigned. Many joined a rising name, Nexa Technologies, a startup founded by Zaria. Montenegro Tech didn't fall from lack of money. It fell from something more vital in tech. Trust. Once lost, cannot be recoded. Julian's new apartment sat on the 3rd floor of an old Brooklyn walk-up, a neighborhood he once wouldn't park in for more than 5 minutes. No driver, no assistant, just a man sitting by a small window, sipping instant coffee from a recycled paper cup. His custom Italian suit hung untouched in the closet. For weeks, he wore faded jeans and plain t-shirts. On the worn wood table sat an old laptop. No more access to Crosstech. No emails from former partners. No texts from those who once toasted his name. Julian didn't turn on the news, but he knew. He knew everything. Because sometimes the silence of the world is the loudest sound, especially when you've fallen from too high and too hard. The new company was called Orion Tech. Clean, strong, forward-moving, just like the way Zaria now stood in front of the world. Within 6 months, Orion secured over $50 million in funding from investors who had once dismissed her. Zaria didn't fight with words. She answered with action. In April, Forbes named her in Top 30 Under 30, turning pain into power. In June, she took the TED stage. Her talk began with a single sentence. "I was once called a side character in my own idea." The crowd gave a standing ovation. Not out of pity, but respect. Zaria didn't just survive, she rose, and this time, no one would ever misspell her name again. Julian didn't hold a press conference, didn't call attention to himself. He wrote a handwritten letter, scanned it, and sent it to 3 major publications, with the subject line, "Not for defense, for admission." In it, he confessed every mistake. "I chose society's approval over the one person who saw my true self. I thought love could be hidden, but silence is its own kind of betrayal." He didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't shift blame, just signed clearly, beneath one final line, "I lost everything. But I finally learned that a person's worth is not in their name, but in how they face who they are." Zaria never replied, and Julian understood. She didn't need to. The TED stage glowed in soft gold. Zaria stood before a silent room. Her eyes no longer carried anger, only the steadiness of a woman forged by fire. She looked toward this front row, smiled gently. "I used to think losing a man was a tragedy, but I've come to learn, sometimes losing him is how you find yourself." The applause rose, then roared. They stood, not for her success, but for her truth. Zaria ended with a quiet but unshakable message. Never let someone define your worth through their silence. If this story made you reflect, leave a heart. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe in the power of truth, hit subscribe. Because there are still stories like Zaria's waiting to be told.